Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're taking on a really crucial stack of sources that explore a memoir that it really did something rare. It managed to transcend genre, politics, and even geography to become just a global phenomenon.
It really did. And we are, of course, talking about Trevor Noah's Born a Crime, stories from a South African childhood.
And the entry point for so many people, which is fascinating in itself, was through a really unlikely figure, Bill Gates.
Right. I mean, when the co-founder of Microsoft, a tech titan, a global philanthropist, puts a memoir about growing up under apartheid on his must-read list, you know there's something more going on.
Absolutely. You know, the lessons inside are far bigger than just entertainment. They're about strategy, they're about resilience, and I think a kind of global understanding.
A necessary one.
So the mission for this deep dive is to really synthesize these sources and understand the machinery behind the story's incredible success. We're going to explore the terrifying political context that Noah survived, the radical, just unshakable influence of his mother.
Who is a force of nature.
Oh, completely. And we'll look at precisely how this unique upbringing, a whole lifetime spent just navigating complexity, how that forged the observational comedian and, the global commentator that we all know today.
And I think we have to begin with that core paradox, the central conflict that gives the book its title and really all of its weight.
Born a crime.
Literally, Trevor Noah was born a crime. His very existence when he came into the world in 1984 in South Africa wasn't just, frowned upon. It was illegal. It was an outright felony.
Okay, let's unpack the legality of that right away, because for anyone listening who isn't familiar with the specific mechanics of apartheid, born a crime can sound a bit hyperbolic.
It sounds like a metaphor.
Exactly. But the sources confirm it was a harsh, undeniable legal reality. What exactly defined that crime?
The crime was, on paper, very simple, but it was devastatingly effective in its application. Miscegenation.
Okay.
Trevor's mother, Patricia Nomboyzile Noah, was black, a member of the Xhosa tribe. And his father, Robert, was white, a Swiss-German expat living in South Africa.
And under apartheid, specifically enforced by laws like the Immorality Act, which dated back to the 40s and 50s.
Those relationships were strictly forbidden. Interracial sex, marriage, any kind of romantic relationship across the color line was criminalized.
So we're not just talking about social disapproval or segregation. This is state-mandated separation, backed up by the full force of criminal law.
Exactly. And violating these statutes was a very grave offense. It could carry penalties of up to 5 years in prison. So you can imagine when Trevor was born, he was physical, undeniable evidence that a crime had been committed against the state.
His life was high stakes from minute one.
Absolutely. It forced his family to live a life that was just defined by secrecy and a constant nagging fear of police surveillance and raids.
That really establishes the personal peril. But to truly grasp the context of the book, we need to understand the scale of the system they were up against. Apartheid wasn't just a bad policy. It was a strategically engineered machine for total racial control.
It was bureaucratic evil codified into law. And we often forget the historical depth here. While racial discrimination had existed for centuries, formalized apartheid, the system of separateness, was really established after the African International Party took power in 1948.
So this was a deliberate, conscious construction.
Oh, entirely. It was a comprehensive attempt to solidify white minority rule over a vast black majority. And the sources are clear that this system wasn't just sort of inherited, it was meticulously constructed, layering one form of oppression right on top of another.
The goal was just total control. Physically, economically, legally.
Total control. And this is where you get those infamous 3,000 pages of rules. These weren't suggestions. These were binding laws that governed every single aspect of your life.
Right.
Where you could live, where you could work, which park bench you were allowed to sit on.
And they included notoriously restrictive legislation, like the pass laws.
The pass laws were a tool of daily terror. They mandated that black South Africans carry these identity documents, or passes, at all times, and that restricted their movement into so-called white urban areas.
And if you failed to produce that pass on demand,
you could be arrested and imprisoned on the spot. It was an incredibly effective way to control the labor market and, just to separate families. It was brutal.
And that's just one example. You also had the Group Areas Act,
which literally carved up the country into racial territories. It forced black families out of cities and into designated townships, these sprawling, underserviced areas, often miles away from where any jobs existed.
So when Trevor and his mother were trying to exist in downtown Johannesburg, they were constantly flouting this law.
Constantly, they were illegal residents in their own city.
Now let's get into the strategic cruelty of the racial classification system itself, because unlike the largely binary black-white racial divide that you see historically in the U.S., South Africa had this really complex three-tier system: white, colored, and black. Why that complexity?
This is where the engineering, in a really dark sense, kind of shines. The three-tier system, and sometimes it was even four, including Indian and Asian categories, was a masterstroke of divide and rule.
Right.
The colored category specifically was critical to this. These were people of mixed European and African or Asian descent, and by granting them marginally more rights and a slightly better social status than black Africans, the government effectively created a buffer class.
It's like an internal policing mechanism. It prevents a unified front from forming against the regime.
That's exactly it. If you look at the economics of it, the colored population had, slightly better access to certain jobs, to housing. And this gave them a stake, however small it might have been, in maintaining the status quo.
It prevented the formation of a massive unified opposition.
It did. The government exploited existing linguistic and cultural differences, driving wedges between black ethnic groups like the Xhosa and the Zulu, and then they used the colored category to fracture any sense of a shared identity or a shared struggle even further.
That really frames the scope of the problem. Yeah. One of the sources we looked at makes this incredibly powerful comparison to encapsulate it all.
Yes, the source noted that apartheid wasn't just segregation. It was this horrific historical synthesis. It combined, and I'm quoting here, the forced removal of natives onto reservations coupled with slavery, followed by segregation all at the same time.
All at once.
All at the same time. It wasn't just oppressive, it was hyper-efficient oppression. It was designed from the ground up to be inescapable.
And so, within this hyper-efficient police state, Trevor's daily life was just the ultimate absurdity. The family had to live in constant, exhausting concealment.
The anecdotes are just startling. I mean, because Robert, his father, couldn't legally acknowledge him. His name wasn't on the birth certificate. And the logistics of a mixed-race child trying to have any relationship with his white father were just ridiculous.
When his mother, Patricia, would visit Robert in the white-only area, she had to navigate this cultural minefield.
She did. She resorted to dressing as a maid.
Which is just chilling, playing into the only legally sanctioned role a black woman could have in a white man's home at that time.
It speaks to her incredible resourcefulness, but also you have to imagine the humiliation that she had to constantly face. But the fear was truly palpable when they were out in public together.
Right. They couldn't walk as a family?
Never. Trevor couldn't walk with both parents. Often he had to be with a colored woman who could sort of pass as his caregiver, while his mother would have to follow at a discreet distance.
And if they were seen together by the police?
The consequences could be immediate and severe. Arrest, fines, potentially having the child taken away.
And that leads to maybe the most shocking image from this part of the book, the moment where Patricia had to be prepared to physically abandon her own child.
It's the visceral truth of their situation. Trevor recounts his mother telling him that if the police approached, she would have to drop him and walk away quickly, treating him, in his own words, like a bag of weed.
That is an unbelievable thing for a mother to have to tell her son.
Think about the psychological reality of that for both of them. For Patricia, it was this awful calculation that a child is less incriminating if the parent isn't visibly associated with them, that she might have to sacrifice herself to save him from being taken by the state.
And for Trevor, as a child, it was the realization that his mere existence was a liability, that he could be discarded just like that for their survival.
It's a constant, terrifying weight to carry. And yet, through all this, the threat of fines, police brutality, imprisonment, Patricia just refused to be confined by the Group Areas Act or the curfew. She was determined to live in downtown Johannesburg, which was completely off limits.
She operated in constant defiance of state power.
Completely. Living without the proper residency papers, moving past the designated curfew times. It all required immense cunning. She wasn't just trying to survive. She was modeling for Trevor a life lived according to one's own convictions, no matter the risk. And that stubborn refusal to yield is really the bedrock of their entire story.
Which brings us directly to her, because if we're looking for the central driver of resilience in Born a Crime, all our sources just converge on one person, Patricia Namboyzela Noah.
She is the anchor. She's the strategist, the complete badass, as one source calls her, and absolutely the beating heart of this story.
And her defiance is all the more remarkable when you consider her starting point. I mean, she's born into a system that was specifically designed to crush her potential from birth.
Absolutely. She grew up in Soweto, which was this sprawling township created as basically a human dumping ground under apartheid policies. And then as a girl, she was largely unwanted by her own father and was cast aside to live in Transkei, one of the so-called black homelands established by the government.
And these homelands, we should be clear, were not idyllic countryside.
Not at all. They were strategically impoverished, they were overcrowded, and they were designed to strip black citizens of their South African citizenship and any political rights. Trevor writes that she was stealing food from animal troughs just to stay alive. This was abject poverty, and it was engineered by the state.
So how does someone escape that? How does she develop the intellectual muscle and the self-reliance to extract herself from that environment?
She just refused to be defined by the economic and geographical prisons that were built around her. Her key insight was that knowledge and language were transferable currency. They were things the state couldn't take away.
And the sources highlight that she learned English from a white missionary. She recognized its power immediately.
She did. She famously said she didn't have food or shoes, but she had English. And this wasn't just about communication. It was about accessing the economic and the intellectual world of the oppressors.
English was the language of commerce, of administration. By mastering it, she gave herself a literal ticket out of the homelands and into the restricted but opportunity-rich environment of Johannesburg.
Precisely. And by the age of 21, having educated herself and figured out how to navigate the system, she managed to secure a corporate secretary job. I mean, that was a massive, massive feat for a black woman at that time.
That self-reliance just defines her early years.
It does. She learned the city layout. She even slept in public toilets for safety when she had to. And she just demonstrated this profound commitment to establishing an independent existence. She had absolutely no safety net.
Her faith is also so central to her profile, but it seems like it was as much a form of subtle political defiance as it was spiritual devotion.
That's a fascinating and I think a really accurate distinction to draw. She was a devout Christian, no question. But her devotion was rooted in the Holy Spirit and a truly stubborn refusal to accept the status quo. It went way beyond simple piety.
Think about her choices. The book says she attended 3 different racial congregations every single Sunday.
A black church, a white church, and a mixed church. In effect, that was a weekly act of integration. It was a border crossing. She was actively flouting the social norms and often the actual laws that dictated racial separation, even in places of worship.
She used her faith to justify living a life that defied the state. She argued that God's law superseded man's oppressive law.
Exactly. It gave her the moral high ground to risk everything. And this same strategic thinking, the same moral determination, it translated directly into her parenting philosophy. She wasn't preparing Trevor just for life. She was preparing him for freedom, a freedom she couldn't even guarantee would ever arrive.
Let's talk about that concept she termed the black tax. She saw poverty as this vicious cycle that had to be broken, and her investments in Trevor were these calculated countermeasures against systemic failure.
The black tax is such a profound concept. It goes beyond just having less money. It's the generational and financial handicap that was imposed by apartheid. It meant a systemic denial of property ownership, of generational wealth creation, of access to quality services.
The system was designed to keep black wealth accumulation at or near zero.
And Patricia saw education and broad knowledge as the only form of capital the state couldn't confiscate. So her investments were highly strategic. She was buying books constantly, enrolling him in an elite private Catholic school, which was incredibly expensive for her.
She was fighting the tax through resource allocation.
She was. And she pushed him constantly to be curious, to question authority, and to master the tools of the modern world, especially English and, technical knowledge. Trevor notes that she was preparing me to live a life of freedom long before we knew freedom would exist. That required immense foresight and incredible sacrifice. She was ensuring he had options, not just survival instincts.
That forward-thinking strategy often manifested in these extreme moments of high-stakes, almost reckless action. Which brings us, of course, to the famous minibus escape anecdote.
This is a perfect illustration of Patricia's survival pragmatism versus any kind of conventional risk assessment. It's an insane story.
It is. Trevor was 9 years old, and they were on a public minibus.
And Patricia, being his Hosa, got into a heated argument with the Zulu driver. Now, given the ethnic tensions that were deliberately stoked by apartheid, that was dangerous enough. But the driver deliberately escalated the situation. He started speeding up to punish her to put the whole family in peril.
And her reaction was not to back down. It was not passive.
Not at all. In a split second, she assessed the risk of staying in that speeding, uncontrolled vehicle against the risk of jumping out of it. And as the minibus slowed down just slightly at an intersection, she made her move.
She opened the door, forcefully pushed 9-year-old Trevor out.
And then leaped out right after him, shielding his baby brother Andrew with her body as they hit the ground, before grabbing them and sprinting to safety.
Now, here's where we have to look at the source material a little critically. It calls her a complete badass, and she is. But given that level of high-octane defiance, risking her child's life to assert herself against a petty tyrant, was this calculated pragmatism, or was there a touch of recklessness in her fight for freedom?
That is a crucial question. And I think if you view it through a modern lens of, privilege and safety, it seems utterly reckless. But in the context of apartheid, where Black lives were constantly subjected to state-sanctioned violence, where a Zulu driver could have literally murdered her entire family with impunity and face no consequences, she was making a pragmatic calculation. She seized control of her destiny and her family's safety when the environment offered her none.
So her action taught Trevor that passivity is the greatest risk in an oppressive system.
Exactly. That survival sometimes requires strategic aggression. You have to take control.
And that philosophy of strategic severity, it's echoed in that other story, the one about the school warden.
Yes, the contrast between external discipline and her internal discipline. Trevor, he was mischievous and quick-witted, and he got disciplined by the school warden, but he just started laughing. He showed no respect, no fear.
Patricia hears about this.
And she confronts the warden, but not to defend Trevor. She tells the warden that he clearly didn't know how to fit a kid, and she knows that Trevor never, ever laughed when she disciplined him.
It's a humorous but really dark moment. It underscores that Patricia was instilling this deep-seated respect for consequence that was necessary for him to survive. To survive the streets, to survive the police state, where a moment of disrespect could literally cost him his life.
Precisely. It was a rigorous, maybe even frightening form of preparation. And beyond that, she instilled economic literacy through her informal ventures. Because Black South Africans were locked out of formal lending, business ownership, and major retail.
She had to create her own economy.
She did. She ran these ventures, selling clothes and goods on the side. And this meant Trevor was essentially her apprentice in an unregulated market.
So he was learning business on the fly.
He was. She taught him about negotiation, risk management, cash flow. He learned how to allocate resources, manage inventory, understand incentives. He got this intuitive grasp of economic behavior that gave him a kind of street intelligence that was far beyond his peers. This was necessary training because the system refused to offer him any kind of structured future.
And finally, maybe the most profound emotional lesson she taught him was how to process trauma.
That's maybe the key to everything. It was the ability to forget the pain in life. She understood that bitterness is a cage. It traps you.
She taught him not to dwell on past injustice or pain.
Right. But to let the experience sharpen you, which means learn the lesson, develop a better defense mechanism, and then, fundamentally, to wake up the next day and move on. This is the foundational philosophy that allowed him to convert all that chaos and pain into humor and observation, rather than being consumed by anger.
Patricia's insistence on breaking the rules and prioritizing Trevor's unique education led directly to a major challenge for him, this profound sense of isolation. Being mixed race in a racially stratified society put him in a really complex social limbo.
He just didn't fit the racial calculus of apartheid. He was, as you said, too dark for the white and often the colored communities, but sometimes he was too light and too articulate in English for the Black townships.
He was an anomaly.
A complete anomaly. And this was the bizarre reality of the racial pseudoscience that the state used. I mean, when they moved to the colored neighborhood of Eden Park, he was treated as an outsider because of his lighter skin and his impeccable English. His identity was always under negotiation, often based on these absurd, arbitrary rules.
We have to mention the infamous pencil test here. It's just such a stark example of the absurdity of racial classification.
It is the ultimate indictment of racial policy. The pencil test was a real thing, used by officials to classify people as either Black or colored white.
So they'd stick a pencil in your hair.
Yes. If the pencil fell out easily, you might be classified as colored, which granted you some marginal benefits. If it stayed put in your hair, you were classified as Black. Trevor was subjected to this system, which highlights how his identity wasn't determined by his family or his culture, but by these pseudoscientific bureaucratic criteria designed solely to put people in a box.
And the internal confusion that his identity caused extended even within his own family.
It created this bizarre set of privileges. His black grandmother was terrified of hitting him. She genuinely believed that while black kids, as she said, stay black when they're disciplined, white kids, or mixed kids like Trevor, would turn green and yellow and purple. She was literally afraid of breaking him.
And his grandfather.
When Trevor was young, his grandfather would call him Masta, which is just, it's a perverse reflection of the leniency that was afforded to lighter-skinned individuals. It was this twisted perk of the system that Trevor observed clearly separated him from his black cousins.
So this isolation born from this confusion of identity, it forced him to develop one of his most crucial survival tools, language.
Language was his shield, and it was his passport. Trevor became incredibly proficient. He didn't just master English and Afrikaans, which was the language of the oppressors, but also Xhosa, Zulu, Tsonga, and Sotho Salana, all key tribal languages.
And this wasn't just, being multilingual. This was, as you put it, linguistic arbitrage.
It really was. He used these languages to code switch, which allowed him to move fluidly and gain acceptance, or at the very least safety, within these wildly divergent communities.
Code switching became the ultimate form of social engineering for him.
He learned how to use the language, the tone, the specific cultural vernacular to instantly establish credibility. And the source material details this perfectly in that story, where he avoided being mugged.
Right. He overheard a group of Zulu boys plotting to rob him. They just assumed he was a vulnerable English-speaking target.
They planned their attack out loud in Zulu, completely confident that he wouldn't understand a word. And before they could make a move, Trevor just turns and speaks to them in fluent contextual Zulu.
And it completely disrupts their plan.
Instantly. He didn't just speak the words. He adopted the cultural attitude, signaling, hey, I'm one of you. The confusion and the immediate backing down of the potential muggers is just a stunning example of language as a defense mechanism. It turned a physical threat into a social negotiation.
And this skill, born of pure necessity, it translated directly into his early career as an entrepreneur. Since he didn't belong to any single group, he learned how to seamlessly move between all of them. He became the ultimate broker.
He realized that to survive, he didn't need deep integration. He needed to be useful. So he became the tuck shop guy at his school. He was a middleman, delivering goods and messages for commission between all the different cliques, the jocks, the nerds, the different racial groups.
He learned that acceptance wasn't about revealing his complex identity.
No, it was about finding one part of yourself that you're willing to share. And usually that was the part that facilitated someone else's desire.
These street-level ventures, which later expanded to selling bootleg mixed CDs and DJing parties, they were his real-world MBA. They taught him concepts like risk management, supply and demand, and inventory control long before any formal education could.
He was mastering the intricacies of the informal economy. And because the formal apartheid system just strangled opportunities for black and mixed-race people, the informal markets, which often bordered on crime, were the only places where true economic dynamism was happening.
And Trevor excelled in that environment.
He did, because he intuitively understood market failures and incentives. He understood that if the state restricts legitimate supply of music, of goods, of opportunity, an informal entrepreneur can step in to meet that unmet demand.
And this brings up a devastating, almost cynical point that was raised in the sources about the role of crime in these communities.
It's a harsh truth about systemic neglect. The source notes that crime, tragically, cared. When the government failed to provide jobs, infrastructure, or education, crime offered, quote, internship programs, summer jobs, and opportunities for advancement in a kind of grassroots structure.
It didn't discriminate.
Not based on race or background. It only required cunning and a willingness to take risks. And this reality explains why so many talented individuals, including Trevor himself for a time, flirted with criminality. It was often the most dynamic economic path available.
Before we move on to the legacy, we absolutely have to cover the moment where Trevor realized that street smarts and business acumen, while powerful, were not enough for global success. I'm talking about the utterly shocking and hilarious Hitler dance party incident.
This anecdote perfectly encapsulates the cultural and historical vacuum that apartheid created. Trevor had this immensely popular dance crew, and his best dancer was a guy named Hitler, which was a common, if historically ignorant, name in the townships at the time.
So they get booked to perform at a cultural event at a Jewish school. A very rare, very significant booking for them.
A huge deal. They start performing, And the crowd, the Jewish students, see this incredible dancer and they start chanting, go Hitler," trying to encourage him, which led, predictably, to an unforeseen dispute and immediate, intense chaos. Trevor and his crew were genuinely baffled. They had no idea why this name was so culturally toxic.
And this was a direct consequence of apartheid's educational policy.
Directly. The regime deliberately suppressed global history, particularly the atrocities of World War II and the Holocaust, because narrative control was essential to maintaining white supremacy. If you don't know the history, the name is just a name.
It was a moment of just shocking innocence mixed with profound offense.
And it was a vital learning moment for Trevor. He realized that localized cunning and linguistic fluency could get him out of a mugging, but to succeed on a global stage, he needed global understanding. He needed historical context and cultural literacy. He learned that ignorance isn't harmless, it can be explosive. And that realization really pushed him to become the highly informed, context-driven comedian that he is today.
As Trevor enters adulthood, the memoir shifts into a much darker phase. It details the domestic trauma under his mother's marriage to Abel, his stepfather, which really forms the emotional climax of the entire book.
Abel was a mechanic who became the father of Trevor's younger half-brother, Andrew. And he was initially charming, but he very quickly devolved into an abusive alcoholic. The name Abel gave himself, Giuseppini, literally means be afraid.
A chilling bit of foreshadowing.
Absolutely. He physically assaulted Patricia, he assaulted Trevor, and even the family's pets. He just escalated the fear within their home to an unbearable level.
But given Patricia's fierce independence and her need for control, why did she stay for so long? And how did the abuse finally culminate?
Well, domestic abuse cycles are incredibly complex, and they're especially compounded by economic pressure. For a long time, Patricia was the primary breadwinner, supporting the family even as Abel descended deeper into alcoholism and violence.
But she eventually made the decision to seek legal protection.
She did, which was incredibly courageous.
Right.
She legally divorced Abel. However, her life remained intertwined with his for a time, which led to the horrifying climax of the book.
She finally leaves him for good, taking Andrew, but Abel tracks her down.
Yes, the confrontation was terrifying. Abel shot Patricia twice, once in the leg and once in the head.
It's just miraculous that she survived.
Miraculous is the word. The sources confirmed that the gun misfired several times, and the shot that did hit her head somehow missed all vital structures, lodging near her ear without causing brain damage. Patricia, with her profound, unshakable faith, believed that God had intervened.
And her physical resilience was immediate.
Astonishing. She was back at work within a week, driving herself, bullet wound and all.
But the physical trauma was almost immediately replaced by the systemic trauma of the legal aftermath. And this reveals the persistent miscarriage of justice that existed even in a post-apartheid South Africa.
This is one of the most critical parts of the book's legacy. It showed that while the laws and the books had changed, the system's valuation of Black life, and especially Black female life, had not fundamentally shifted.
First, she faced barriers just getting medical care.
Right. Doctors were hesitant to treat her without health insurance, which highlights how economic exclusion just seamlessly replaced legal exclusion as a way of maintaining the old status quo.
And the court system was even more damning.
It was. Despite shooting a woman twice in broad daylight, Abel received only 3 years of probation. No jail time.
None.
None. And this outcome reflected a systemic lack of protection for domestic abuse victims in the post-apartheid courts, where crimes against Black women were often treated with this alarming leniency. It was a stark reminder that the judicial system, even without apartheid laws, still worked against vulnerable Black South Africans who were seeking true justice.
And Trevor, who at this time had been struggling with his own business ventures, trying to find independence, he also had a direct run-in with this flawed judicial system.
He did. After his small credit and loan business failed, he was apprehended in a car that he suspected was actually stolen from Abel's garage, which led to him spending a week in jail.
It wasn't a life-altering sentence, but the experience was deeply formative for him.
It exposed him to the devastating reality of other people who were trapped in that system, with no resources for legal defense.
He recounts encountering this large, desperate man who was jailed for shoplifting PlayStation games.
And that image is so potent. It solidified the lesson that a lack of access to legal and financial resources, not necessarily a lack of morals, is what truly defines the underclass in South Africa. The economic and legal barriers that apartheid created had merely morphed. They hadn't disappeared. And that made crime appealing and self-defense impossible for the poor.
So if this is the chaos, the trauma, the systematic injustice that Trevor survived, how does all of that translate into the comedy we see on stage and on screen today?
It translates directly. It translates because his comedy is rooted in this acute, observed complexity. The tools that he used for survival, his intense observation, his mimicry, his linguistic fluidity, and that necessary emotional distance are the exact mechanisms of his humor. He translates chaos and street wisdom into comedy gold by dissecting the underlying mechanisms of power and culture.
Humor, in this context, becomes a necessary defense. It becomes a currency.
Absolutely. It allows him to approach these incredibly difficult, often painful subjects like race, inequality, and systemic oppression without alienating his audience.
Yeah.
By interspersing these funny anecdotes with detailed political and historical context, the very structure of the memoir is ingenious in this way. He invites you, the reader, to grasp the ludicrousness of racism while you're laughing.
He learned how to read an audience.
From the Pentecostal church to the volatile streets, he learned how to craft narratives that connect.
And his ability to seamlessly transition between languages and cultural codes is really the blueprint for his international success, particularly as the host of The Daily Show.
His role as the Daily Show host requires him to analyze institutional power and cultural narratives through linguistic dissection. He has this unique capacity to explain a complicated global issue by adopting different voices, different perspectives, and framing it all through humor. This ability to code switch across cultures allows the audience to disagree with a perspective while still respecting the person, which fundamentally promotes dialogue.
And this blend of authenticity, vulnerability, and complex context is what drove the book's immense global appeal. It's what ensured it became this cultural touchstone, recognized everywhere from high school curricula to, as we said, Bill Gates' reading list.
The global impact is immense. I mean, the book's success is a case study in media economics and cultural resonance. It offers a crucial window into a part of the world that 99.9% of people will never get to view in this kind of intimate detail.
It serves as a critical point of reference for what it means to be a human on this planet, how to navigate systemic injustice with creativity.
Precisely. And the extensive audiobook sales, the translations, they all attest to its accessibility. Trevor Noah transformed his lived, specific, painful experience into a universally resonant narrative on resilience and identity. His mastery of cross-platform storytelling, leveraging his comedy background to structure the narrative arc, cemented his unique voice, the cultural chameleon born of chaos, as a leading global influence, far, far beyond the world of comedy.
So as we synthesize this deep dive into Born a Crime, it becomes so clear that Trevor Noah's story is a triumph that was forged in the fires of adaptation and strategic defiance. We've really seen three immutable forces that shaped his narrative and ultimately his global career.
First, you have the legal absurdity and the institutional malice of apartheid itself. It made his very birth a confrontation with the state and defined his early life by the absolute imperative of secrecy and hiding.
Second, you have the fearless resilience and the strategic, forward-thinking parenting of Patricia Noah, who taught him survival, self-reliance, and crucially, the philosophical power of letting pain sharpen you without ever allowing it to destroy you.
And third, there's the necessity of linguistic and entrepreneurial adaptability. The skills he learned on the streets and in the informal economy, which provided him with this intuitive grasp of human incentives, of market failures, and the cultural landscape skills that would later fuel his entire career as an observational comedian and media leader.
And why this book and why this deep dive matters to you, the learner, is actually pretty simple. It is a masterclass in how creativity and observation are the ultimate survival skills. It demonstrates that the greatest insights often come from those who exist outside the system, who are forced to see its mechanics precisely because they were never meant to be a part of it.
And that leads us to our final thought for you to reflect on, drawn from those microeconomic lessons Patricia taught and the risk management Trevor learned in that informal economy. Consider the political implications of the informal resistance that's described throughout the book. Its large oppressive systems of control, whether they're political, economic, or social, are only as strong as the people who are willing to enforce and follow them. What parallels can we draw today?
The memoir shows us that street-level cunning, the kind gained in a chaotic South African ghetto, often provides a clearer strategic map than any textbook. The ability to outsmart, to circumvent, and to understand incentives better than those in power is the truest form of adaptability. And maybe the ultimate lesson of Born a Crime is that freedom isn't granted. It's constantly earned through radical self-determination.